A note before this one begins. If this is the kind, text you a note before we start. If this is the sort of case that leaves you wanting more. Not just one, but 10, each told in full, each in a voice made for the dark. There's a collection called What the Mountain Keeps. 10 files from 10 counties, 5 states, spanning 1893 to 1955. Every one of them walked up into ground that looked easy, and every one was signed off by the law with the wrong word. 10 hours to sit within the dark, start to finish. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Now then, there are places on the map that were never meant to be measured. The people who tried it in the last century mostly came back and admitted the failure. Some of them didn't come back at all. In July of 1893, 7 of them walked into a stretch of the Grand Canyon that nobody had ever properly charted under a federal contract. With cameras and theodolites and mules and enough provisions for 4 months. None of them ever came out. Not one. 61 years later, a Bureau surveyor walked into that same country by accident, and he found what was left of them, still arranged the way they had left it, in a bend of a canyon that has no name on any map, even today. Before we go any further, tell me wherever you're listening from tonight. Drop it in the comments. I like knowing how far a story like this one travels in the dark. The name on the paperwork was the Prendergast Geographic Survey. The Department of the Interior had wanted for close to 15 years, by then a proper accounting of a sector of the northern rim, west of what we now call the Kaibab Plateau, where the surveys of the 1870s had left long white gaps on the master map. Nobody at the department expected trouble from it. The country was rough, but it was known country. Rangers and cattlemen crossed the plateau every summer. The mules were the same mules, the rotes were the same rotes, and the man they hired to lead it had done a piece of the Powell, work as a younger man, and come back with all his fingers. His name was Caspar Prendergast, 47 years old that summer, a geologist out of Yale who had spent 20 years since his degree doing survey work for the Corps of Engineers and for the Western Railroads, and who had a reputation among the men who had worked under him for a caution that bordered on the religious. He would not begin a day without checking every strap on every mule. He would not eat before his party had eaten. He would not sleep before the guard on the perimeter had been set. He was not a man who lost people. He was known, in fact, as the man you hired when you did not want to lose people. He had brought a party of 19 back alive out of a March blizzard on the White River in 1886. He had brought 14 back alive out of a canyon flash flood in the summer of 1890. There is a letter in the archives from a chief engineer of the Santa Fe Railroad who wrote in 1892 that Caspar Prendergast was the only surveyor in the western states he would send his own brother out with. By the accounts of the townspeople who saw them off, Prendergast was thin, quiet, with a beard trimmed short and hands that had a lot of small scars on the knuckles from a life of handling rock hammers and mule tack. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He read scripture in Latin most evenings by lamplight, and he kept a small brass compass on a leather cord at his throat, given to him by his father the night before his father died. He carried it every day of the survey. It was returned eventually, but we'll come to that. His party was 67 strong when they set out from Flagstaff on the 11th of July in a train of 8 wagons and 112 mules. It took the outfit 2 full days to load. The Flagstaff paper of that week, with a photograph taken by Cyril Ashkettle himself before he joined the party, of the wagons drawn up in a line outside the mercantile with the mules already in harness. The men standing along the wagons in their coats and hats, Prendergast at the head with his hand on the neck of the lead mule. That photograph survives. It is in the county museum in Flagstaff to this day, in a wooden frame under glass. And every face in it looks straight at the camera, except one man near the back, the second guide, Elias Marchwood, who is looking sideways at something outside the frame with an expression that a museum docent once described to me as the look of a man who has just remembered something he was supposed to do, and now knows he will not have time to. 12 trained surveyors under Prendergast, most of them men in their 30s and 40s, who had worked the western basins before. A botanist by the name of Ambrose Thrall-Kettle out of the Smithsonian, older with a bad hip, who rode a mule the whole time and who had published 3 years before the definitive monograph on the pinyon, juniper woodlands of the Southwest. A cartographer, a Frenchman by the name of Sylvanus Rawle, 38 years old, said to be one of the finest hands with a plane table west of the Mississippi, and who had left Paris for reasons he never explained in writing. A photographer, Cyril Ashkettle, brought up from a studio in Prescott, hauling a wet, plate outfit and enough glass to fill 2 mule panniers, mule packers, cook staff. 2 hired guides who had been up and down the plateau their whole working lives. An older man called Winford Coldstream, and a younger one, whose name in the roster is set down simply as Elias Marchwood. A small detachment of teamsters, 67 people in total. Every one of them accounted for by name on the roster. The Department of the Interior filed the following December, when the government finally had to admit that not one of them had ever come back. There was one warning, only one that we know about. On the morning of the 12th of July, the second day out from Flagstaff, an older Havasupai man rode up to Prendergast's lead wagon on the trail. Nobody knew his name, and nobody thought to write it down. He spoke to Prendergast for perhaps 5 minutes in a mixture of English and his own language. Thrall, the botanist, who was closest to the 2 of them, later said the man had spoken calmly and without heat and had gestured twice with his open hand at the country ahead of them, and had then wheeled his horse around and ridden back the way he had come without waiting for a reply. Prendergast, when Thrall asked him what the man had said, told him only that the guide had wished to know their destination and had wished them a safe passage. Thrall did not believe him. Thrall wrote in a letter to his wife that night that the guide's face had not been the face of a man wishing anybody a safe passage. It had been, Thrall wrote, the face of a man who had come out that morning to say something he did not want to have to say later. That was the last letter Ambrose Thrall ever wrote. It reached his wife in Washington on the 23rd of July. She kept it. It is in the archive now. There is one line in that letter near the end that has been read many ways over the years by people who have gone looking for it. Thrall wrote, in a hand that is noticeably less steady than the rest of the letter. My dear, Prendergast was pale for an hour after that man rode away, and he would not say why, and I have not seen him pale before. That is all Thrall wrote about it. He signed the letter and gave it to a writer, going back to Flagstaff that evening, and by the following morning the party was in country from which no rider would ever come back. There is one other thing about that morning of the 12th of July that Thrall did not put in his letter to his wife, but that came out much later in a deposition given by one of the teamsters in the summer of 1895. The teamster, whose name was Elias Sturbridge, said that when the Havasupai man had wheeled his horse to leave, he had passed close by the wagon Sturbridge was driving and had spoken to him in English, one sentence, quietly, meant for him and not for the party. Sturbridge said the sentence had been, "Do not eat when the others eat, and do not sleep when the others sleep, and if you can turn back tonight, turn back tonight." Sturbridge turned back that night. He was the only man from the entire train who did. He gave his notice to Prendergast at the second camp on the evening of the 12th of July, and he rode back to Flagstaff alone. And he was the reason we know as much as we do, because he was the only person who had walked with the 67 who was still alive to talk 2 years later. When the second search came out, the route Prendergast filed with the department was a conservative one. Nothing about it was reckless. They were to work a rough diamond of country, roughly 40 miles across, from the north rim down into one particular side canyon that had never been walked by a white surveyor, and then out along a plateau to a resupply point where they were to be met by a smaller party on the 7th of August. That resupply party made the meeting on the day. They waited 7 days. Nobody came. On the 15th of August, they rode down as far into the country as they safely could, and they saw nothing. Not a smoke, not a mule track, not a scrap of paper caught on a sage bush. They rode back to Flagstaff, and the sheriff there wired the department. And the department did what departments do. They sent more men. The leader of the resupply party, a man named Ozra Whitmore, gave a short statement to the sheriff in Flagstaff on the 17th of August that is worth reading in full, and that is preserved in the county court records. Whitmore said, and this is the exact wording of his statement, that on the second night of the wait at the meeting point, his men had heard from the direction of the country the survey was working a sound like a great deal of talking. Indistinct but continuous, going on for perhaps an hour after full dark, and then stopping all at once, as if a door had been closed. Whitmore said the sound had been distant enough that he had not been able to tell the number of voices, only that it had been many, and that his men had ridden out toward it in the morning and had found no one and no track and no sign that anyone had been closer than 10 miles to their camp that night. He signed the statement. He did not amend it. He rode home to his wife in Prescott, and he did not take another contract with the department for the rest of his working life. When the wire from the sheriff reached the department on the 20th of August, the assistant secretary who read it did not act for 6 days. There are notes in his own hand in the margin of the wire that survive in the archive. The notes read, in order, no cause for alarm, then ash kettle to develop plates on return, and then in a different pen and evidently later, cot grave available. That third note is when the assistant secretary began to be afraid. Cotgrave was not the sort of scout you called when you thought you were sending men to look for a party that had merely gone deeper than expected. Cotgrave was the sort of scout you called when you thought the men you were looking for were probably dead. The first search party proper was 22 people under a former Army scout named Wendell Cotgrave, 51 years old, a widower, a man who had once tracked a party of horse thieves for 8 days across the Mojave and brought them all back alive. He rode out on the 29th of August. He rode the whole route Prendergast had filed, and he found the first camp exactly where it was meant to be, on the bench above the head of the side canyon, 3 days in. The ashes of the fire were cold, but the stones were set neat. The mule pickets pulled clean out of the ground and stacked in a small, tidy pile beside the ring of the fire. Cotgrave later said the strangest thing about that first camp was that nothing had been taken and nothing had been dropped. Somebody had broken the camp the proper way. Somebody had rolled the canvas and packed it. Somebody had walked the mules away in a line because the tracks were clear for 100 yards past the camp, and then they weren't. The tracks stopped. Not faded, not blown over. Stopped, as if the mules had walked into the air. Cotgrave was a hard man, not given to that sort of description. and he was careful in his official report to say only that the trail had become undetectable. But in the private letter, he wrote to his sister in Denver 2 months later, the letter that ended up in the county museum in Flagstaff after her death in the 1920s. He said something else. He said, "I have followed men into rougher ground than this and never lost their sign. And I lost the sign of 67 of them and 112 mules and 8 wagons in one afternoon of the driest August I can remember." He said, and these are his words, "God forgive me, but I do not think that country wanted them found." He said further in the same letter that, on the 6th night of the search, his men had refused one by one to take the second watch, and that he had eventually stood the watch himself, and that during that watch he had heard from the direction of the canyon they had been unable to enter that day because a rockfall had blocked the trail, a sound he had heard once before in his life, in Kansas in 1874, on a night after a great many people had died in a fire at a hotel. He said the sound was the sound of a great many voices trying to be quiet and failing, and being aware of the failing. He said he did not sleep that night or any night for the remainder of the search. He said he had known then that they were not going to find anyone. He stayed out for 6 weeks. He found the second camp 2 days deeper in, and it was the same tidy, empty, cold. He found no third camp. He found no bodies, no belongings, no tools. On the 14th day of the search, at a place his men called after him the Switchback Camp because they had made a night there on their way in and again on their way out, one of his men, a young rider from Utah by the name of Rufus Culwell, walked away from the fire after supper to relieve himself and did not return for 11 hours. When Cotgrave finally found him at dawn the next day, Culwell was sitting on a stone half a mile from camp with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes open, and he did not respond to his own name. He was breathing. He was warm. He simply would not respond. He came back to himself late that afternoon and could remember nothing of the night at all, except he told Cotgrave that he had at some point in the dark heard someone in his own voice call his name from behind him and had turned around and had not been able after that to remember which way was back to the fire. Cotgrave sent Culwell out with a rider the next morning. Culwell did not speak again on the ride out. He rode with his eyes closed. Cotgrave wrote in his private letter that when the two of them reached Flagstaff 8 days later, Culwell dismounted, thanked the sheriff, walked into the mercantile, bought a train ticket to Salt Lake City with the whole of his search pay, and boarded the eastbound that afternoon. He never wrote to Cotgrave, and he never wrote to his family. He was, as far as Cotgrave was able to determine in the years afterward, never heard from again. He found on the 11th of October, in a place he and his men had walked past twice already, one thing: a wooden shipping crate of Cyril ash kettles, unexposed photographic plates, unbroken, still latched, sitting on top of a red flat rock in the middle of a dry wash, with no shade anywhere near it. Cotgrave later wrote that the crate did not look weathered. It looked as if it had been set there that morning by somebody who had wanted him to find it. He carried the case out on his own mule. When they developed the plates in Flagstaff at the end of October, 3 of the 12 plates had images on them. The rest were blank. What the 3 images were of, we will come to shortly, because they are important. The second search party went out in the spring of 1894's, 31 people under a different scout, one Ephraim Sawtell, who had actually met Caspar Prendergast at a survey conference in Denver in 1889 and considered him a friend of a professional sort. Sawtell spent from March into July out on that country. He found nothing new, not one thing. He found the same 2 camps Cotgrave had described. in the same immaculate condition, as if nothing had disturbed them across a whole winter of weather. Sawtell wrote in his report that the fire ashes at the first camp were the same ashes. He was certain of it. He said in the report, and I am giving you his exact words here, that the wind had not moved a single flake of ash in 8 months, and that when he crouched down and put his hand into them, they were cold in a way that made him stand up and step away, and not go near the fire ring again. He did not say what he meant by that. He was a plain-spoken man, and he chose in his official report not to say. In a letter he wrote a decade later to a man at the Smithsonian who was preparing a monograph on the disappearance. However, he said more. He said the ashes had been cold, in the way that the hand of a dead person is cold, and that they had not felt like the ashes of a fire at all. He said he had reached down expecting warmth, because the sun had been on that ring for 2 hours by the time he arrived, and he had felt, instead, a coldness that had traveled up his arm and settled behind his teeth, and that he had spat on the ground beside the fire ring and had not been able to look at the camp again for the rest of the day. He said in the same letter that his men, one after another, over the course of the second month out, had begun to have the same dream. He said the dream was of a great many people walking away down a slope in a canyon, none of them turning around, and that the dreamer could not call out to them because there was no sound in the dream at all, not even the sound of the dreamer's own breathing. He said 3 of his men had asked to be released from the contract by the end of June, and he had released them. He said he had considered releasing himself. There was a 3rd search in the summer of 1895 under a party leader whose name is now lost, and then a smaller effort in the summer of 1898, a private expedition funded by the family of Sylvanus Rawle, who did not believe the department had done enough. None of them found anything. There was one small congressional hearing in the winter of 1896, at which the widow of the botanist Ambrose Thrall gave testimony asking that the department be compelled to send a 4th party. The transcript of that hearing runs to 62 pages. It is one of the strangest documents in the whole federal record of the case. The widow, whose name is given only as Mrs. Thrall, testified for over 4 hours, and at the end of her testimony, she was asked by the chairman of the committee whether she believed her husband was still alive. She said, and I have the exact words in front of me, I believe my husband is somewhere. I do not believe he is dead in the way the department believes he is dead. I believe he is somewhere the department cannot go. She was thanked for her testimony and asked to step down. The department was not compelled to send a 4th party. By the turn of the century, the file was closed. The word the department chose to close it with was misadventure. It was the wrong word. It was the wrong word by any reading of what those people had left behind, and it stayed the wrong word on the file for 61 years. A breath here before what comes next. If this is the kind of case you'd want to sit with in the dark, not just hear it once, but keep it. There's a collection I put together with the people at Forbidden and Unresolved Stories. What the Mountain Keeps. 10 complete cases. 8 hours, 62 years of records nobody wanted to finish. Each one placed, dated, and signed off with a tidy word that never once fit what happened. The link is in the description below and at the top of the comments. Have you ever had that feeling that something bad was about to happen and been right, and then wished you hadn't been? Drop it in the comments while I go back to this one. Let's go back to it. The man who reopened the case did not set out to reopen it. His name was Milburn Osteryck. In the spring of 1954, he was 52 years old, and he worked for the Bureau of Reclamation out of a small office in Kingman. Arizona, doing preliminary siting work for a series of small check dams on side drainages that fed the Colorado River. He was not a famous man. He was a competent surveyor with an Army background from the First War, and a good ear for a country he did not know. And the assignment he drew in that April was to walk a particular, unnamed side canyon on the northern rim and get a written description of the floor of it, so that the engineers in Denver could decide whether the mouth of it was worth a damn. The canyon he was sent into was inside the diamond Prendergast had filed on in 1893. Osteryck did not know that when he went in. He found out when he came out. There was a reason the canyon was still unnamed 61 years after the survey that was meant to name it. Osteryck was, by his own later account, a man who had chosen the survey trade because he had come back from the war in 1919, unable to be indoors for long stretches. He had married in 1922. He had lost his wife to influenza in 1934. He had not remarried. He lived alone in a small house on the edge of Kingman. And he owned 2 dogs, and he read the Kingman paper front to back every evening. And he took his coffee in the field, black and unsweetened. He was the kind of man the Bureau of Reclamation liked to send into places nobody had been. He did not talk much. He did not complain. He wrote a clean report. He went in with one companion, a Havasupai man in his 50s named Osmond Fairweather, hired out of a settlement south of the river as a guide and a packer, 3 mules and provisions for 11 days. The country up on the plateau in April is not hard country. It is cool at night and warm in the day, and the water in the small pools is drinkable if you strain it. They made 12 miles the first day and camped on a bench above the drop. Off into the side canyon they had come to survey. Osteryck said later, in the deposition he gave in Kingman the following November, that Fairweather did not want to camp there. Fairweather did not say why. He simply moved his own bedroll 100 yards, down the bench away from Osteryck's fire, and lay down with his rifle across his chest, and did not eat that night. Osteryck asked him once quietly whether there was something Fairweather knew about that piece of ground that he ought to share. Fairweather looked at him for a long moment and said only, in English, "We do not go into that canyon, and my father did not go into it, and his father did not go into it, and if you were listening to your dreams, you would not go into it either." And then he turned his back and went to his bedroll. Osteryck slept badly. He wrote in his field diary the next morning that he had dreamed all night of the same thing over and over. He had dreamed of a line of people walking away from him down a slope, none of them turning around, and that when he tried to call after them, no sound would come out of his mouth. He wrote that when he woke in the dark, he could hear, or thought he could hear, the sound of hooves passing on the sand below the bench, a great many of them going somewhere in a hurry. He got up. He walked to the edge of the bench with his lantern. There were no hooves. There was no sand disturbed. There was, however, on a flat piece of scree about 10 feet down the slope, a single line of prints, small and even, that had not been there when they had made camp. He wrote in his diary that they were the prints of a man in worn boots, walking east. He wrote that he did not follow them. He wrote that when he returned in the morning to look at them again, in daylight they were gone. They went down into the canyon that afternoon. It took them 9 hours to get to the floor. Osteryck wrote in his diary that the descent was harder than it should have been, given the country. He wrote that the trail was solid, the light was good, the temperature was not extreme, and yet by the 3rd hour of the descent, both of them were breathing hard, and one of the mules had thrown a shoe on a piece of ground where a mule should not have been able to throw a shoe. He wrote that at the 5th hour of the descent, Fairweather had stopped on a wide place in the trail, and had looked out over the canyon, and had said in a quiet voice, "We are the only ones down here." Osteryck had said, "Of course we are the only ones down here." Fairweather had said, "No, you do not understand what I am telling you. I am telling you that there is not a bird down here. There is not a lizard on the rocks. There is not a fly on the mules. Look at the mules. Look at their faces." Osteryck wrote in his diary that he had looked at the mules and that Fairweather had been right, that the mules were standing with their heads down and their ears back in, the way mules stand when they are being asked to walk into a corral they do not want to walk into. The trail was old, cut by hooves and unshod feet, and Osteryck wrote in his diary that the trail was too well made for a canyon this far off the roads. He wrote in his careful engineer's hand that somebody had spent time on this trail once, a lot of time, and that whoever it was had not been Havasupai and had not been recent. He was correct on both counts. When they reached the floor, there was a wide bench of red sand shaded by a bend in the wall, and in the shade of that bend, arranged in a rough square, were 8 canvas tents. All 8 of them were standing. All 8 were closed at the flaps. The canvas was faded to a bone color by 61 years of light, but it had not rotted. The guy ropes were tight. The pegs were still in the ground. Osteryck stopped walking. Fairweather stopped 10 paces behind him and did not come any closer. Osteryck said in the deposition that he stood there for a long time, maybe 5 minutes, maybe longer, and that he could hear his own breathing and nothing else. No wind, no bird, no water, nothing at all. He walked up to the first tent, and he untied the flap, and he looked inside. Inside the first tent were 6 bedrolls, laid out in 2 rows of 3, unrolled and made up as if for sleeping. On the ground between them was a folded wool blanket with 3 tin cups on it, and an open Bible turned to a page in the Book of Job. A pair of boots stood at the foot of each bedroll. The boots dry and dusty, but still shaped as if the feet had only stepped out of them that morning. A briar pipe lay on one of the pillows. The tobacco in the bowl not smoked. The tobacco still smelling faintly of tobacco, after 61 years in the closed tent. Osteryck backed out of the first tent without touching anything. He went to the second tent, and the second tent was the same 6 bedrolls made up, boots at each, a cup, a Bible, a pipe. He went to the third, and the third had a small folding desk against the far wall with a leather-bound journal open on it, and an ink pot uncapped beside the journal, and a pen laid across a fresh page. The ink in the pot was dry, but there was a small bead of dry ink at the tip of the pen, as if whoever had been writing had lifted the pen from the paper in the middle of a word, and then not put it back down. The last word written in the journal was, and I am giving you the exact word here, listen, just that, listen, and below it, the pen had made a single line down the page the length of a hand, as if it had rolled from the writer's fingers a moment after the word was written. Osteryck went to the other 5 tents as well. He wrote what he found in each of them in his field diary that evening, sitting on the bench outside, before he had opened the journal. Tent 4 contained 4 bedrolls and a portable typewriter set on a folded coat with a partial sheet of paper still in the roller. The letters visible on the sheet spelled out a report to the department, dated the 3rd of August, describing a productive day of surveying and requesting nothing out of the ordinary. The report broke off mid-sentence. Tent 5 contained the botanist Ambrose Thrall's collection, or what would have been his collection, 28 numbered specimen bags laid neatly in rows on a canvas ground cloth, each one properly labeled, each one empty. Not spilled, not eaten, empty. Tent 6 contained the cook's stove and utensils and a cast iron pot half full of a stew that had dried to a hard black crust. And beside the stove, 3 shirts folded on a stone in the manner of clothes, set out to be worn the next morning. Tent 7 contained the photographic equipment of Cyril Ashkettle. The camera was set up on its tripod, facing the eastern wall of the canyon. Osteryck did not touch the camera. He looked through the ground glass. He wrote in his diary that what he saw through the ground glass and what he saw with his naked eye, when he stepped back from the camera, were the same wall. He wrote that he was writing this down because he wanted a record that they had been the same when he had looked. Tent 8 was empty, not empty of people, empty of everything. No bedroll, no equipment, no anything. Just the canvas walls and the sand of the floor. And in the sand of the floor, near the back wall of the tent, one thing laid down neat, as if the person who had laid it down had known someone would come to find it. A pair of eyeglasses in a leather case, the case unclosed. The eyeglasses lying beside the case on a folded square of paper. Osteryck lifted the paper. On the paper was written, in a hand he did not know, one line, "It wid are not lost. Please stop looking." He put the paper down where he had found it. He did not take the eyeglasses. He walked out of Tent 8, and he sat down on a stone in the sun, and he did not move for several minutes. When Fairweather finally came up the bench toward him, he asked Fairweather what the paper meant, and whether Fairweather knew who could have written it. Fairweather looked at the paper without going inside the tent and said, in English, "Whoever wrote that did not want to be found by you. If they had, they would have written it in a language you did not have to be told." And then Fairweather walked back down the bench and did not come near the tents again. He carried the journal out into the sun. He set it on a flat stone. He turned back the pages. The handwriting was Caspar Prendergast's. That was determined later by comparison with letters the man had written to his wife and to the department. But Osteryck already suspected it before he was told. He had read every published word of the 1893 case as a younger man. The way boys in that country read about lost expeditions, the way boys in other places read about pirates. And he had held Prendergast's field notes in his hands, once as a graduate student in 1922, in an archive in Washington. He knew the hand when he saw it. He turned back through the journal, and he sat down on the sand, and he read every entry from the first day to the last. It took him the rest of the afternoon. The first entries were unremarkable dates, weather, mileage, the small notes an experienced surveyor takes for himself at the end of a working day. Made camp on the bench. Water good. Rawle measured the wall at 914 feet from the notch. Botanist collected 8 well. It went on like that for 3 weeks. Then on the 2nd of August, which is the day the resupply party 120 miles away was preparing to leave for the meeting, the tone changed. Prendergast wrote, and these are his exact words, "The elder guide, Coldstream, refuses to enter the third bend today. When I ask him why, he tells me the sound of the canyon is wrong. I hear nothing. That is when I understand what he means. The wrong sound is no sound. There should be sound and there is not. Even the mules will not go forward." 2 days later, on the 4th of August, Prendergast wrote, "We have moved camp forward against Coldstream's advice. He remained at the previous position, and I have left him a mule and provisions for the walk out. The others say he was gone by evening, but no track leads out of the bench. I will not write what the others say happened to him. It cannot have happened. I did not see it, and I will not commit it to this page." On the 6th of August, he wrote, "The compass at my throat has begun to turn. Not to point, to turn slowly, like the second hand of a watch in a full circle, and then to stop, and then to begin again. Rawle's plane table cannot be leveled here. The bubbles will not settle. He has broken the instrument and told me it is dust in the glass. I know Sylvanus Rawl, and there is no dust in his instruments. On the 7th of August, Prendergast wrote, Marchwood, the second guide, walked out of camp in the middle of the night. He left everything, his boots, his coat, his rifle. His boots were still warm to the touch when we found them at the edge of the bench in the morning. He is gone. There is no track. I have set 2 men on the trail out anyway. They came back within the hour and said they could not go on. They would not say why they could not go on. Thrall tells me privately that they came to the mouth of the canyon and could not remember why they were there. On the 8th of August, he wrote, the date above is wrong. I have written the 8th of August because that is what my body tells me. But the last light was 3 hours ago, and the light before it was 3 hours before that. We have not slept, and we have not eaten, and no one is hungry, and no one is tired. Thrall sat down this evening and said that his hip does not pain him. He has not said that in 20 years. He is weeping. He will not say why. On what he wrote as the 9th of August, though Ostertag said later he could not be sure what day it actually was, because the writing had begun to overlap the writing of the previous day on the same physical page. Prendergast wrote, Ash Kettle photographed the eastern wall this morning. When he developed the plates in the tent tonight, the wall in the photograph is not the wall we can see. In the photograph, there is an opening in the wall, a doorway. He has photographed it 3 times, and there is a doorway in all 3 plates. There is no doorway. I have walked to the wall and put my hand on it. It is stone. And yet Ash Kettle will not put down the camera. He keeps taking photographs of the wall. He says that in the photographs the doorway is opening. He says he can see people inside it. Now I have looked at the plate. I have seen no one. God forgive me. I do not believe him, and I do believe him at the same time. On what would have been the 10th, Prendergast wrote only 1 line. He wrote, the wall is thinner tonight. I can see through it now. God help me. I can see what is on the other side. The last entry was undated. It was a single word and then the line where the pen had rolled. Ostertag had already read it in the tent. Listen. Ostertag closed the journal. He put it in his pack. He looked up, and the sun was very low over the western rim of the canyon, which he could not explain because the last time he had checked his watch, it had been 200 in the afternoon, and his watch now read 217. He looked at his watch again. The second hand was moving. The minute hand was not. He called for Fairweather. Fairweather did not answer. He walked back to where the trail came down into the canyon. And Fairweather was already there, standing very still with the 3 mules already packed. All of them saddled and roped as if the 2 of them were leaving that minute. Fairweather said only one thing. He said, "We go now." Ostertag did not argue. He looked once quickly over his shoulder at the row of 8 tents in the shade of the bend, and he thought for a moment that he saw a man standing at the flap of the 3rd tent. A tall, thin man with a beard trimmed short. But when he looked properly, there was no one, and the flap of the 3rd tent was still tied the way he had tied it after he had come out. They started up the trail. They climbed out of the canyon that afternoon and evening and night, and they did not stop when it got dark, and they did not stop when the mules went lame. And by the time they came out on the plateau, the 2 younger mules had blood on their fetlocks from stones they should not have been able to feel through their shoes in the dark. Ostertag did not remember most of the climb. He remembered only that the whole way up he heard, or thought he heard, behind him, above him, somehow both at once, in the walls of the canyon, a sound he had not heard in the canyon itself, wind. the sound of a great wind moving through canvas, and under that, very faint, the sound of a great many people trying to speak at once and not quite being able to. He wrote in his field diary that night, after they had reached the plateau and made a small fire, that he had begun in the last hour of the climb to be able to make out words, not sentences, words. And the words were his own name, said over and over by many different voices at once, some of them close and some of them far, and none of them, in a voice he recognized. He wrote that at one point in the last mile, before the plateau, he had stopped on a switchback because a hand had touched him on the small of the back. He wrote that he had turned, and there was no one there. He wrote that Fairweather was 50 feet ahead of him, and had not looked back. He wrote that he did not tell Fairweather about the hand. He wrote that he did not tell anyone about the hand until the deposition, and even then he only wrote it in the margin in his own handwriting after the stenographer had left the room. When they came out on the plateau at what Ostertag's watch now read as 400 in the morning of the next day, though his body told him no time had passed at all. Fairweather turned to him and said one more thing. He said, "Do not tell anyone what you saw down there. Do not tell them where you were. Do not tell them for as long as you live." And Ostertag in the deposition said that he had asked Fairweather why, and Fairweather had said only, "Because they can hear us talking about them. Because they are listening." He filed his report through the proper channels. He did not mention the tents. He did not mention the journal. He wrote that the canyon was unsuitable for a dam site due to fractured bedrock and adverse geology, and that no further survey was required. The Bureau of Reclamation accepted his report without comment. The file was closed a second time. In late October, however, he took the journal down to the county museum in Flagstaff and gave it to the woman who was the curator at the time, an Alma Grigsby, 70 years old, who had known Ephraim Sawtell as a young woman and who was one of the very few people in the county who still remembered the 1893 case in any detail. She did not open the journal in front of him. She took it into a back room. When she came back out to him, she said only, "Thank you, Mr. Ostertag, and I will see it is kept, and please do not come back for it." 2 weeks later, in the second week of November, a fire in the archive of the museum destroyed the room she had put it in. Only that room. The rest of the building was untouched. The fire marshal reported that the fire had begun in a filing cabinet in a drawer that had been locked from the outside, without evident cause. The journal was ash. Alma Grigsby was found the next morning in her own house across the street, sitting in her reading chair, quite dead of what the county doctor called natural causes, with a small brass compass on a leather cord laid across her open Bible. Nobody in the family could account for the compass. Ostertag could account for it. He recognized it. He had lifted it, though he had told no one, out of the third tent, off the pillow, where it had been coiled next to the pipe that still smelled of tobacco. He had left it on Alma Grigsby's counter along with the journal. He had not told her what it was. He gave his deposition in Kingman on the 12th of November. In the deposition, he told what he had seen. He told the whole of it. He told about the 8 tents and the boots and the pipe. He told about the folded paper in tent 8 that read, "We are not lost. Please stop looking." He told about the compass. He told about the journal. He told about the sound coming up the canyon behind him. He told about Fairweather's warning on the plateau. He told about the ashes at the fire ring in the first tent that had been cold of being the cold like the hand of a dead person, in the exact frame Sawtell had used 60 years before. Though Ostertag could not have known that phrase, because it had been in a private letter he had never read. The stenographer who took the deposition, a woman by the name of Loris Enderby, wrote a note at the bottom of the last page after Osteryck had signed it that the deponent had appeared during the giving of testimony to be reliving what he was describing, and that at the point in the deposition at which he had described the sound of his own name being said behind him by voices he did not recognize. He had stopped speaking for close to 2 minutes and had asked her quietly whether she could hear anything unusual in the room. She had written that she had told him no, she could not, and that he had nodded and continued. The deposition went into a Bureau of Reclamation file, and then into a federal archive, and then into a box in a warehouse in Suitland, Maryland, where a researcher I know found it in 1984 and photocopied it before it was sent for disposal in the general purge of records that happened later that decade. That deposition, and the 2 long letters Osteryck wrote to his sister in the last year of his life, and the fragments of Coggrave's letter to his own sister that made it into the museum before the fire, and the report of the resupply party from August of 1893 are what we have. The 3 surviving photographs from Ash Kettle's crate are held privately by a family in Nevada who have never permitted them to be reproduced or examined by a specialist. The first by the description given by one of the 2 people who has been permitted to see them, shows a line of people walking away from the camera along the bottom of a canyon in full daylight. At least 40 of them, none of them turning around. The second shows the same canyon at the same hour empty. The third shows the wall of the canyon, and where the wall meets the sand there is an opening in the wall that no geologist has been able to identify with any known feature of that country. And on the sand outside the opening there are footprints, deep and clear, leading out, not in. Out. The person who described the photographs to me said, "One more thing that has stayed with me." She said that on the back of the third plate, in a hand she believed to be Ash Kettle's, was written a short line in pencil. She said the line read, "If you are reading this in Flagstaff, do not come after us. We are not gone. We are only somewhere else." She said the family in Nevada would not let her take a photograph of the writing. She said they had told her the writing was fresher than it should be, and that they had reason to believe it had not been on the plate when the plate had first come out of the crate in 1893. She said the last time she had visited them, in the winter of 1971, the man who owned the plates had shown her a small brass compass on a leather cord that had come, he said, into his possession by mail in an envelope with no return address sometime in the previous month. He said the envelope had been postmarked from Kingman, Arizona. She had asked him quietly if the name Osteryck meant anything to him. He had looked at her for a long moment and had said only that he did not open his own mail if the envelope did not have a return address, and that he did not intend to start. Osteryck lived another 14 years. He did not go back into that canyon, and he did not visit any other canyon in the northern part of the state. He did not go on any survey again after 1954. He worked from a desk in Kingman until his retirement, and he died in Prescott in the summer of 1968, in his sleep, in his own bed. According to the coroner, according to the woman who came to sit with him the last week of his life, a niece by marriage, who was the one to find him. In the days before he died, he had begun to say something over and over, half in his sleep. He had begun to say, "I can hear it now. I can hear it now." She said he did not seem afraid when he said it. She said he seemed almost relieved. She said the strangest thing about the last afternoon of his life was that when she came in to give him water, he lifted his head off the pillow and looked past her at the doorway of his own bedroom. and he smiled the smile of a man who has been kept waiting a very long time, and who has just heard the person he has been waiting for come up the walk. And then he lay back and closed his eyes and did not open them again, she said. And this is what she told the county paper the year after he died. That when she went to make the arrangements at the funeral home in Prescott, she had asked the undertaker to leave the top button of his shirt open, because he had never worn it buttoned in life, and that when she had gone in for the viewing, there had been a small brass compass on a leather cord around his neck. She had not put it there. Nobody at the funeral home admitted to putting it there. The compass was buried with him. The Prendergast Geographic Survey remains officially a case of misadventure. That is still the word on the file. 7 people, 112 mules, 8 wagons, cameras, ledgers, instruments, provisions for 4 months. 2 camps left tidy. 1 crate of glass on a red flat rock. 3 photographs held privately in Nevada. 1 journal burned. 1 compass returned to a woman who died the same night, and returned again 14 years later to the neck of a man who had carried it out of that canyon, and who had never once, in his own account, understood how it had gotten back. 1 folded piece of paper in a tent, in a hand nobody could identify, that said, "Please stop looking." If you believe there are places in this country where the wall of the world is thinner than it should be, this is your story. If you do not believe it, this is your story as well, because someone will need to explain to you what happened to those 7 people, and what Milburn Osteryck heard behind him coming out of the canyon, and what Cyril Ashkettle photographed on a wall that was only stone, and why the last word in Caspar Prendergast's journal was the one word it was. Have you ever felt, standing somewhere quiet, that the silence around you was not empty but occupied? Drop it in the comments. Tell me the place. Tell me the year. If you know a story like this one from your own country or your own family, share it below. It may become the next case I sit with in the dark. And if you'd like to sit with more of them, the link is where I left it in the description and at the top of the comments. Stay with me. Until next time.